Hello everyone. Here's an optional tutorial if you are looking for an extra challenge or just get enticed by this and you want to play with some extra software. I want to introduce you to the process of photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is an interesting technology that allows you to create 3D assets, models and meshes and textures and what have you through photography of real world objects. So the advantage for us is that, again, with this kind of project where we're like making VR content without learning to program and without learning to 3D model, so far we've been pretty stuck with like available assets that exist. But if you want to create a 3D model out of something that you have in the real world, you kind of can. Now, the way we're going to do it, it'll end up looking a little glitchy, a little bit molten. But if you're okay with that, if that plays into your aesthetic, this can be a pretty exciting tool to work with. So I suggest one of two pieces of software to do this. If you have a DSLR or a decent camera, and you're going to take your own still photos and import them to a computer, then I think you should use Alice Vision's Meshroom to do this. It's free, but it is PC only. So that's the other if. If you're running on Mac, then I think you should use this smartphone app, Display.Land. The difference is basically if you are able to take more control of your photography settings, like with a DSLR, you could potentially get better results. But for ease of use and convenience, I have to say Display.Land is pretty awesome. Here's the process. You take a boatload of pictures of an object that you are rotating ever so slightly all the way around. And you want to get like at least 50. Be better if you had more. That's another reason why it can be hard to do on the smartphone, because I know a lot of us are riding pretty close to our to our storage limit. But if you can, you're trying to get dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures, and then you would like to get them from a lower angle as well. The other thing that's important about this process, whether you're doing it in Meshroom or Display.Land, is that ideally you want something that has no reflective surfaces, so it's not chromed or anything. It's not very spindly, so like a stick or a tree with no leaves on it or something, that would be a very hard thing to get a decent model out of. So something a little chunky that is not super reflective, and then the lighting conditions, you would really prefer to have no shadows at all if you could help it. So a bright sunny day is not so good. A nice overcast day is great. So that kind of all over lighting, diffuse, is the goal. And so once you have all those, if you're using the phone app, you can automatically upload those photos that you took with Display.Land, and it'll generate a 3D model for you. If you're using Meshroom, it's a similar process, which I'll show you briefly here. So for Meshroom, you would open up the software, grab all of your photos, drop them into the area that says drop images or folders. You should go through and make sure that there aren't any that have motion blur, because that will really mess up your render. We'll save the project, and I'll put it in the same spot where I had my photos. So I'm going to be in the Photogrammetry folder, and I'll hit save, and I'll call this toy car. And then there are settings down here that you can change. It uses kind of a node-based system, which maybe you would have seen if you've ever used something like DaVinci Resolve. But honestly, we do not have to touch any of this to get a pretty decent result. It's automatically like fairly set and forget. And some of this stuff is beyond what we would need to play with just to get a model out of this. So we're gonna hit the big green start button and then wait a really long time. And you'll see that each of these nodes has a process indicator going from orange to green when it's finished, and it just takes a while. And it's going to go through each of these steps and dump out results that it needs to ultimately get to a final mesh and texture that we can use. And when it does, it puts everything into this folder that's saved wherever we saved the project, called Meshroom cache. And the results of each one of those node steps is in its own folder. We want to go all the way to the absolute end, the texturing result, and this stuff is what we need. On Display.Land's website, they've got a lot of tutorials that are useful, and this one, Display.Land to Blender, will give you a pretty clear idea of the differences in the process and the similarities. Once you essentially walk around an object in Display.Land, you upload, and then you can do some simple editing in the app, which is great. And then you go up here to the download button, and we're going to need an OBJ file, the OBJ 3D mesh, and that's what we're going to take into Blender. Whether we're coming out of Meshroom or Display.Land, we will now go into a second piece of software that is Mac or PC and is also free, and that's Blender, which is a 3D modeling and animation program. So the reason we will download and install Blender is that these models that come out of Meshroom or Display.Land are way too complex to be used for VR or game design. They have too many polygons, and they will just bog the entire system down, and it'll run very slowly. But we can use Blender to clean them up and limit the number of polygons that are in these models. So when you open up Blender, you can close the splash screen and click on and delete the default cube that is in the center. And now you have an interface that is perhaps slightly scary, in that you may have never used a 3D modeling program before, but it's not too awfully different than dealing with Unity. just frustratingly has slightly different buttons. So, you can move around by holding the middle mouse button, change your view. But we're going to import an OBJ file. And we're going to grab it from our Photogrammetry toy car Meshroom cache folder. It's in texturing, and it's this OBJ file. So after a while, this finally loads. It's an enormous it's an enormous 3D model, so it takes a long time for Blender to load this up. You'll also note that it's turned over, which we can fix. But when you first get it, you'll be like, "Whoa, what did I get here?" So I'm going to click this thing to select it, and then I'm going to make sure that over here I'm in the textured mesh transform. And if I'm not, it's the sort of orange square here, the object properties. I can rotate this. In this case, like so. I can also change the location to try to center it up a little better, because I want my car more or less aligned with the origin point here. Okay, and then we'll get down to business. So with Blender, what I want to do is essentially delete all of this ground, because it's not what I'm trying to bring in. I'm just trying to get the car, and then I want to bring the car down in complexity in terms of the number of triangles that it's made up of. So I'm going to select all of this stuff and delete it. And here's how. On the keyboard, I'm going to hit 5, which is going to make this view kind of flattened in like an orthographic projection. And then I'm going to hit 4, which is going to sort of lock my camera to bird's eye. And now I'm doing that on a keypad on the side. Just the regular 5 and 4 do not do that. Okay, so now I'm going to hit Tab on my keyboard. This is going to bring me into edit mode. So this in Blender allows you to edit the mesh instead of just editing the whole scene, and you're selecting the entire mesh. Now we're selecting all of the little pieces parts. I'm going to change to wireframe view, which is up in the top right here of what's called the viewport. You choose the circle that looks like it's in wireframe. And then I'm going to hit B for box select on my keyboard, and click and drag a box around this car. Now I've selected everything in the car, and I'm going to go to select again, invert, and hit delete. And I want to delete vertices. And what this is doing is it's deleting every one of these millions and millions and millions of points that made up the vertices of these triangles that are building this whole mesh. And as you can see, even at this level, I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of them. It's still a very, very complex mesh. We just had a ridiculous amount up until now. And so now after you've done that, your computer should be a whole lot happier with you. But we can't stop there, because this object is still far too complex for Unity to deal with. So we're going to go back to this shading method, and we're going to hit Tab to come out of edit mode. Next, we will be adding what's called a decimate modifier. So if you go over here to this wrench and click that, we're going to click add modifier, and we're going to choose decimate. Okay, so we've applied decimate. Take a look at the face count. This has 1.8 million triangles that are making it up, and that is far too many. We would like to get it much smaller here. So we're going to click ratio and type 0.1 to bring it down to 180,000. And it'll take a moment to do all that math and figure out the result. And then really excitingly, that hasn't lowered the quality too awfully much. It still looks as janky as it ever did, but we haven't gotten ridiculous yet. So you can try lowering that again, you know, maybe it's 0.07. See where we get to, where it finally becomes a visual problem for you to lower it any further. 0.02 is probably going to be too much. You know, I just want to demonstrate like what it looks like when it's bad. Yeah, you start to get these you start to get these really obvious triangles popping out here. So I think about, for this model, I think like 0.06 is landing in a pretty good sweet spot, and that's very positive because we came down from nearly 2 million faces to only 100,000, and so then, you know, you could get more specific about your selection. If you want to lose more of the ground, you could, and now, if I'm happy with that result, I can hit apply on the decimate modifier, and that'll make this a permanent change. And then you can change to this final viewport shading option to see what it looks like with its texture on it. And so, like I said at the beginning, you know, it's a little janky. It like has a little bit of a glitchiness to it in the look, but it's also kind of amazing how for no 3D modeling really involved, we ended up with a pretty convincing 3D model. So for the right use case, you know, especially in the context that we're doing like a dream or a surreal location, these could be really interesting aesthetics for objects to populate your scene with. We want to hit Control A and apply all transforms. So that all that rotation and stuff that we did earlier becomes a permanent part of this object. So then we're going to File, Export as an OBJ file. We're going to call this toycar.obj, and we're going to export. And then we should be done in Blender. We can save that project just in case. So then we're going to go and get, all right, we need a lot of things right now. We need the toy car OBJ. we need the toy car material, that's a .mtl, the textured mesh material, and all of the texture.pngs. All of that stuff should be dragged into a folder in our Unity project that you can make called Photogrammetry. Click on this toy car and click Extract Materials. Make a little folder called Materials and select that folder. And now this toy car is available for our project. So I'm going to put it here in place of that yellow cube that I haven't liked much since we've moved on to bigger and better things. So I'm going to put it maybe right there, nicely next to my Persian rug. And this is the result. I've got my toy car here. Looking pretty cool amongst all the rest of my stuff.